So I'm really delighted to welcome you to our third panel of this conference on ethical challenges in the development of new weaponry. We are now going to talk about biological weapons, and we have some extraordinary experts here to help us do that. Victoria Sutton, I will introduce again, even though she was the moderator for our last panel. She is the Paul Whitfield Horn Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Biodefense Law and Public Policy, a center devoted to biodefense, biosecurity, and bioterrorism, and issues of law relating to those topics. She directs the JDMS program in environmental toxicology, biotechnology, agriculture, and applied economics. Dr. William Caspier is the director of the Innovation Lab at Beyond Conflict, a nonprofit organization dedicated to developing science and technology to prevent conflict and assist in reconciliation. Before joining Beyond Conflict, Bill was the Senior Research Area Manager in Human Systems and Autonomy for Lockheed Martin's Advanced Technology Laboratories, where he led science and technology development programs to improve human performance in multiple domains and to boost the ability of humans and autonomous systems to work together. And Jonathan Moreno, hero of taking people seated a little out of order, second over here to my right, is my colleague here at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is the David and Lynn Silfen Chair. He is also Professor of Medical Ethics and Health Policy, of History and Sociology of Science, and of Philosophy. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., and the author of multiple books, a recent book written with our president, Amy Gutman, that has been getting quite a lot of attention. I am missing one bio here. I'm going to introduce our moderator. Christopher Jacobs is the newest member of the CERL team. He joined us last June as a CERL Research Fellow. He comes to us after serving 27 years in the U.S. Army, most recently as an officer in the Army JAG Corps. And I apologize because I don't have your bio here, which it was supposed to be, and I don't have the details. But I'm going to ask Mr. Barnett to do his own bio for me, and I sincerely apologize that I don't have the details, and I'm very bad at remembering them.
I'm Edward Barrett. I am at the Stockwell Center at the United States Naval Academy. I'm Director of Research there, researching military ethics topics. And I was in the Air Force for 30 years, 22 years flying and 8 years on the staff, doing future force structure planning. Most of that reserves, but busy reserves.
Thank you so much, and my apologies again for not having adequate preparation documents in front of me. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Christopher Jacobs, and I look forward to the panel.
Thank you. So this morning, for those of you who may not have been here this morning, we started off with cybersecurity and AI. Then we moved into the convergence of biological and chemical. And now we're moving into biological enhancements and genetics. And later, the next panel will be on nanotechnology. These different areas, as we saw in the last panel, they're not neatly binned. They're not perfectly siloed. There's crossover between them. And you saw that in some of the questions for the last panel. And so for this panel, I'm going to try to leave a little bit more time at the end for audience questions to bring in some of that was present from the last panel. But I'd like to start, to somewhat structure this, with Victoria Sutton. Professor Sutton, could you start sort of by explaining how you came to be where you are now, how you came to be an expert in bioengineering and biocrime and the military aspects of this technology?
Sure. Sure, thank you. I started out as an environmental scientist. I actually wanted to be a veterinarian, but no women got into veterinary school that year. So I went on to become an environmental scientist. My PhD is in that area. And I was lucky enough to get a spot at EPA. And when I was at EPA, it was the time that climate change just came on the national stage, and we had the first framework convention, so I was invited to go to OSTP. So from there was sort of history. In OSTP, I was an assistant director for what is now the National Technology Council, Coordinating Council. It used to be called the Federal Coordinating Council. And as you know, presidents always change the name, and when they come in, every president does it. And I, of course, was exposed to an amazing new education about how technology and weapons and security work together. And that really launched my research after that. I served on some academy committees. And I realized when I was in Washington, for my science colleagues out there, that it was really hard to get anything done if the lawyers didn't understand what we were talking about. So I made it my mission to teach lawyers, law students about science. So that's what I do at Texas Tech University. So in the course of doing that, all my focus really tended to be around security. So I teach cybersecurity, space law, biosecurity, global biosecurity, and environmental law. So, so I've been doing that for the last 20 years, and the amazing growth in that area has meant it's a very vibrant research area, as all of you know. So that's how I got here.
So if you could take a few minutes to teach us, mostly lawyers in the audience, about bioengineering and biological enhancements and what you've been teaching at Texas Tech.
Well, I've written several books on this topic, so I'll try to make it a 5-minute or 2-minute summary. I think maybe the way I separate biosecurity issues and bioweapons are those that are clearly intended for a lethal effect, whereas whereas biotechnology typically in that area has more commercial value. We think of it more commercially. Now there's lots of crossover there, but that's kind of the way we separate it when we're thinking about it, I think, from a legal perspective. You've got intellectual property issues and those kinds of things in biotech. So that's kind of how I see those two issues playing out. Biotech has a whole different set of challenges. You've got intellectual property, especially. You have research labs that are maybe perhaps have different objectives. You have FDA regulation, whereas you have DoD focus and State Department in bioweapons. So from a lawyer standpoint, you've got different agencies focused on these two to a great extent. Now, not to say there isn't some crossover there.
So as with many of the areas that we're talking about today, the technology has been advancing very rapidly. And when that happens, there's advances for the good, and then there are advances which cause concern. Could you identify some of the things that are for the good in this area and those which cause you the most concern?
Oh, that's a big question. So how would I categorize that? I think from a lawyer perspective, a scientist lawyer, I think the area that's probably the most out of control because we don't understand it very well is human germline gene editing. And we don't really have a good feel on how to regulate that. And I think that's the thing that we really need to try to get a little bit ahead of to see what kind of framework do we need. Now, we have a World Health Organization committee that was formed immediately after the announcement from China that there was the first edited human. And then we have another committee, Mirror Committee, which just shows you how dire the situation is. We have 2 international committees operating. And we're trying to sort out how those actually, what role each one of them has. So I think that would be my answer. That's the one that I think is most
That's the biggest
concerning
concern.
right
And for the good?
For the good. Well, I think it also is great. I mean, it could have amazing impacts on the quality of human life. So human germline gene editing is incredibly promising at the same time.
So before we turn to issues of governance and regulation, I'd also, at this point, like to bring in Dr. Caspier. So you have an Air Force background, and you currently are the director of the Innovation Lab at Beyond Conflict, which is an organization devoted to advancing peace talks, transitions to democracy, and national reconciliation. So if you could explain for us how you start in the military and end up with an organization devoted to sort of post-conflict resolution.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. And thanks to you and Claire for the generous introductions and the chance to be here. It's really an honor. I spent most of my time in the U.S. Air Force in the intelligence analysis trenches. And I came to realize while doing that work that human psychology played a big role in how well we did our work as all-source analysts. And so that got me interested on the academic side of the house and studying human cognition formally. So that led to some of my graduate school training in neuroscience and cognitive science. And from there, it was really a hop and a skip to a realization from talking with my fellow warfighters before I exited the service that we spend most of our time, even in uniform, not dropping bombs, pulling triggers, setting off explosives, but rather building allies, making friends, governing, filling in empty spaces in public institutions that need to exist in areas where you need security and stability, and exercising a whole host of skills that involve good moral judgment and good moral development. And so the lateral move then from there into industry to develop technologies that can help us improve, especially our non-kinetic use of influence in the military domain, and then to the NGO where I am presently was fairly easy.
So when you were in industry and also at DARPA, you were working on projects related to performance enhancement. Could you describe some of those? Explain what is in the realm of the possible? Because there's a lot of sort of myth out there. There's a lot of Hollywood. What is in the myth or in the realm of the possible?
Okay, great, Chris. Yeah, I'll take a whirl of that. So when I was at DARPA in both the Defense Sciences Office and the Biological Technologies Office, my portfolio was in applied neuroscience and cognitive science. So I used findings from the neuroscience to help think about, especially, how we might better train, educate, and influence warfighters and the populations that they deal with. So that's a pretty broad remit. Some of my colleagues were doing more of the genetics work that you mentioned earlier, man. And so I won't pretend to know anything about that. I watched it unfold. I know just enough to be dangerous. I'll instead focus on that augmented cognition portion of the description of this panel, since a lot of the programs I ran were in augmented cognition. And I continued that work on the industrial side in the labs that I stood up for Lockheed Martin. There, we were building closed-loop performance improvement systems. So what I mean by that is that we were looking at the interface of human beings, of soldiers, and machines, and using a sense, assess, augment framework to help us build systems that can improve the performance of that human-machine team. So what I mean by that is you use a variety of sensors, some of which are neurobiological, some of which are physiologic, to assess the state of a warfighter. Use a variety of assessment methods, including machine learning techniques, to make sense of that data. Is my warfighter tired? Is she stressed? Is she cognitively overloaded? Does she have skills in one area rather than another for this particular task? And then finally, we would augment performance somehow. We would do something different as a result of that sensing and assessment process. So sense, assess, augment, and then close the loop on that. So that's a very generic framework you can use to think about human performance improvement technologies in the military context. So here's mine. Now I'll get on thin ice. I'll make some predictions. I think 5 years from now, there will be fielded human performance improvement systems that involve autonomous and semi-autonomous units. So let me give you one example of one that I built in my lab at Lockheed that works. It is used, it's called the Sensor Suite for Warfighter Augmentation and Training. It uses a variety of sensors, including electroencephalograms and pupillometry and eye tracking, to make judgments about the amount of workload that a pilot in a simulator is experiencing. then that judgment can be fed into the sorties that you're flying inside of that flight simulator to change how difficult they are so that you get better training effect. And maybe you can trim the amount of time you have to be in pilot training from a year and a month down to 6 or 7 months, which would be huge savings given how much money and time it takes to train pilots. So that system works. We've demonstrated it to Air Force Research Labs, and I suspect something like it will be fielded a few years from now. So I think 5 years from now, we will have fielded closed-loop performance improvement systems. I think 10 years from now, that sense, assess, augment cycle that I mentioned will have made enough progress, especially on the sensing and assessment side, that some of those sensors will start to essentially disappear. That is, they'll either be built into the warfighter's kit, or they might even go below the skin or into the brain. There are some assessments you can make about brain state, for instance, that would be super useful in helping you do things like allocate tasks amongst team members in the human-machine team. So I think that at the 10-year time point, those will mostly be used to treat warfighters for the effects of having gone to war, right? Not for operational performance improvement, but I think there's a chance that some of those technologies, somebody mentioned nano needles this morning, for instance, that are minimally invasive, might actually be used for sensing purposes. A nano needle, it's like a piece of Velcro that you put on top of your skin. It penetrates just a very low amount into the dermis. Doesn't even hurt. I put them on myself many times as part of the development work I did at DARPA. And it senses, it can sense interstitial fluids. And in interstitial fluid, so it's not blood, it's the white fluid between blood vessels. There are all kinds of chemicals that are related to your current state, whether you're stressed, whether you're experiencing heightened anxiety, whether you're under severe workload, that could be useful. Finally, 15 years out, I think we might be at the point where some of the programs that DARPA is exploring presently that are purely exploratory might be useful operationally. Those include things like non-germline modifications to increase the resilience of soldiers against stress and disease and related technologies. Jonathan and I were having a conversation over lunch about how the number one issue that keeps our ground soldiers from deploying outside the wire to accomplish a mission is gastrointestinal distress. If you can help us figure out how I can vaccinate someone against gastrointestinal distress, that would hugely amplify the impact of our fighting forces downrange. So let me stop there. I hope that gives us a good introduction to, I think, what is the art of the possible.
This is a great time to bring in one of our next panel members, and that's Professor Moreno. Professor Moreno is a professor of medical ethics and health policy, of history and sociology of science, and of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. And as you have famously said, you have a problem with focusing on a single topic. Meaning that Professor Moreno prefers to look at things through an interdisciplinary lens. You have written extensively on neuroscience, neuroethics, national security, all of these issues that we've been talking about. And I also note that your work was used in developing the screenplay for the movie Born Legacy. So if you could fill us in on some of the other technologies that are being used and applied to performance enhancement.
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, I didn't make a penny on the Born Legacy, just so you know. I didn't know until a couple of weeks after the film came out, and I saw it with my daughter, that the screenwriter said, and I read Jonathan Moreno's work to make sure that the film is accurate, which was hilarious because anybody who's used my work knows that you can't rely on it for accuracy. Also, I want to say that I'm no longer a senior, I'm no longer a senior fellow at Center for American Progress. So they're not responsible for what I say. And but an old resumes never die in the internet era. No worries. Well, I'm not sure quite how to start with Chris's good question, but maybe it would be fun to play off what Bill was just saying, and we were talking about at lunch, because it's not exactly breaking news, but when I taught history of ancient philosophy to undergraduates 35 years ago. I never got a note from a journalist that would, change my teaching. There wasn't that, it was like nothing happened in commentary about Plato's Republic that would change the way I taught it, particularly to freshmen. So, but about 3 hours ago, I got an email from a journalist in Washington I said to him, you cannot believe what I'm going to be doing this afternoon. So this is a very reasonable question. So in the journalist's words, and I asked him if I could talk about this. He said, yes, this panel. He said, DARPA wants to explore CRISPR-Cas9, you all know roughly what that is, and other synthetic biology technology to boost service members' immune systems, allowing them to produce antibodies and perhaps other defenses, such as antitoxins, against a wide range of threats. So this is sort of what Bill was just talking about. Now, is that gene editing? If you use CRISPR-Cas9 to modify the way that genes respond to the environment, right, regulatory responses, what people would call epigenetics, is that genetic engineering? Is it? How many think it is? Okay. How many think it isn't? And most of you do not either care or have no clue. Well, so that's a great division, actually, because it's a reasonable, is it genetic modification or isn't it? So this is what the Defense Department has said. And by the way, although the journalist did not use the acronym PREPARE, which is the program in question, it's the PREPARE program. It's called PREPARE. You can look it up. It's not secret. And this is what DoD said in response to this journalist's query. DoD is exploring biotechnology that would temporarily add capabilities to genes that would boost the human body's natural defenses, maybe a bug that caused the GI distress, and even allow the reversal of the effects of biological weapons after exposure. So this capability could be scaled in proportion to anticipated threats, that service members and first responders could administer these treatments before or after exposure, et cetera, et cetera. We are interfacing only, and this is the key language that distinguishes between what some people would consider genetic modification and others wouldn't. We are only interfacing with the epigenome and transcriptome, the cellular messages that carry out DNA's genetic instructions inside cells. In other words, they're figuring out how to turn, using CRISPR-Cas9, to turn the genes on and off under certain environmental conditions, like being exposed to a toxin. They do not consider, and people I think in science generally would not consider turning genes on and off to be a genetic modification or an enhancement, any more that the flu shot that I should have gotten by now, would be considered an enhancement. It's a prevention. And in fact, the National Academies, a couple of years ago, wrote a report in which they were very careful when they were talking about gene editing not to discourage the adoption of these kinds of technologies for disease prevention. So although to a commander, and there's a few commanders here, a commander may think this is a great enhancer in some ordinary language use for the fighting force because it protects them against a toxin. It's not considered an enhancement, technically speaking, any more than a vaccination would be considered an enhancement. So this to me is a really interesting problem of communication. It's the way that scientists and bioethicists, in fact, would talk about enhancements. It's not necessarily the way that ordinary folks or people in command responsibilities would talk about enhancements. But, and to some people, this is really angels, this is angels dancing on the head of a pin. But it turns out that it's extremely consequential in terms of how far or what kinds of experiments an agency can do.
Sir, are you aware of other programs that may actually constitute gene editing that might be in the works?
I'm not. Well, there are. I think at last count, something like 19 clinical trials for sickle cell that involve gene editing, and they actually do involve modification of the DNA chromosome itself. But in the military context, I don't think as far as I know, Bill, I don't think anybody is actually doing any somatic DNA modification. But there are clinical applications that are exciting. For sickle cell, for cystic fibrosis, for what are called recessive disorders, for which there are treatments but not cures at this point.
So you mentioned some uses that are for the good and some that are for military purposes. Is it possible to draw that kind of line? Is it possible to bin these things, or?
Well, I would say that they could be for the good, although military, since I would like my family and me to be protected. So that to me is not the interesting distinction. There are dual use, and there's lots of dual use since fire, right? There's a lot of dual use. So that's the way that I would be interested in thinking about it.
So since there is the potential of dual use,
Yeah.
what is being done about that, and what maybe should be done?
Well, so this is the way I got into the intersection of bioethics and national security. 25 years ago, I was staff for a presidential committee on human radiation experiments. That's how I got into this. And the Nuremberg Code turned out to be a very important reference point for us. So the Nuremberg Code was part of the decision that the judges at the Nazi war crimes trial for the so-called Nazi doctors, the Nuremberg Code is a 10-point code that they published concerning human experiments. And the judges, to make a long story short, were surprised that there were no internationally recognized rules for doing human experiments. So they wrote what posterity has come to know as the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code has been important for people in sort of civilian medical science and often honored more in the breach than the reality. But it turns out that the Nuremberg Code was extremely important for the only federal agency that ever adopted it verbatim. One federal agency in the United States adopted the Nuremberg Code word for word. What was that? The Defense Department in 1953. The Defense Department in 1953 adopted the Nuremberg Code word for word as its guidance for doing human experiments for defensive purposes in what was then known as ABC warfare research, atomic, biological, and chemical warfare research. Working on this commission, when we sort of figured that out, I said, this is just incredible, because this is about dual use, right? Prevention, defensive purposes, if you know how to prevent something, you tend also to know how to do it. And so the scales fell from my eyes, and I realized that so much of what happens in human experiments historically has been for national security purposes.
So if I could go back to Professor Sutton, you've written a lot about dual use and your concerns about it and how it might be mitigated or dealt with. Could you explain that within the biosphere, I guess?
Well, dual use, we talked about it a little bit on the last panel, but basically it just means that you're working with something that could be for good and it can be for bad. And it's exactly the same research. And how you distinguish between how to treat that is the problem. Does it require more oversight? Does it require more security because of that characteristic? And we were also talking about how it's just only so effective, and who makes the decision has a lot to do with it too. An individual researcher versus a committee, or all together. And with not having constraints on publishing, it's really very hard to control it anyway. So it's pretty diluted, but that is a way of looking at it ethically, is to look at the dual use part of it.
So we're focusing just for a moment on the rule of law aspect. Are there sufficient laws? Is there a sufficient regulatory scheme in place to deal with these issues?
Well, like we mentioned, it only, DIRC, the dual use research of concern, only applies to NIH-funded research. So I think there are ways to do this. I think if, for example, the patent office required every researcher, funded or not, to prove that they have followed a dual-use analysis before they were allowed to get a patent, then that would solve a lot of our problems. That would probably require statutory change to the IP, the Patent Act. But it shouldn't be that hard. But getting anything done in Congress is a bit hard these days.
Especially today.
If I were an agency, I might try to write a reg with existing authority to add that to part of the review process.
Can I just say that one of the really fascinating things to me as an historian of science about the dual-use dilemma in the life sciences is that in general, the life sciences have not been as highly regulated as the physical sciences and engineering. You could say physical science and engineering grew up in a national security environment to a great extent. But the life sciences, for the most part, have not. So when I'm losing track, but 15 or 16 years ago when I was sitting on a committee for the Homeland Security, at this time there was a debate in the life sciences world about what they could publish and what they couldn't. For example, there was a study that was published about how easy it was to get toxins into the milk supply. It was published, I think it was by the Proceedings National Academy of Sciences. There was another piece about how easy it is to make synthetic polio and so forth, remember these. And so this was, of course, a few years after 9/11 and the Anthrax attack. So DHS was saying, what is it with you guys? Why are you publishing this? But life scientists had, in general, not been brought under this kind of security regime.
That's right.
And DIRC has been part of this last 15 years, but it's still a bit of a struggle.
Yes.
Lots of ethical issues are bubbling to the fore here. And so I'd like to bring in our fourth panelist, and that's Dr. Barrett, Director of Strategy and Research, Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the United States Naval Academy. So you've been teaching ethics for some time now. So from an ethical perspective, how do you approach these issues?
Yeah. I first delved into this issue in 2009 and 10. So my center researches a different ethics issue relevant to military operations every year. And so in 09-10, we decided to do 4 emerging military technologies: unmanned, human enhancement, cyber, and non-lethal weapons. And so, and my views actually have not changed that much from that initial foray into this issue, which involved reading your book, Mind Wars, which was really helpful at the time. And basically, I see 4 interesting ethical issues. And I mean, there are obviously a lot of positives that could result, but being Irish and Catholic, I like to focus on the negatives. So I'm just going to focus on 4. I mean, the first is obviously the side effects, and so those would have to be dealt with in an ethical manner. The second would be the so-called emotional enhancements for soldiers. You like soldiers to be aggressive, you like them to be fearless, but there's certain agency issues that would be involved with those kinds of changes, and so but I have a feeling that those should be taken off the board as possible enhancements, the emotional ones. And then let's just focus for now on cognitive enhancements, and let's just assume that some pretty radical cognitive enhancements are possible. So there are basically two concerns associated with these. The first comes out of the eudaimonistic school, that human flourishing would be affected adversely. And there are a couple of different thinkers that have talked about this. One was Leon Kass in that 2003 bioethics report. And his focus was on the fact that human beings with these enhancements would be adversely affected because they wouldn't be having the will as stridently for these enhancements in their lives. Okay, I don't see that as a really strong critique. I think they would start at a different plateau and then use their will just as much and arrive at a higher place. So I didn't think that critique was so satisfying. A second critique out of this eudaimonistic school came from Michael Sandel in a 2007 book on like the price of perfection or something like that, the title of the book. And his focus was on the fact that enhanced humans would be less dependent and less humble. And in as much as these two variables are conducive to human flourishing, these individuals would be, less flourishing. Okay, I think that's interesting. I mean, it's nothing new. Solipsistic narcissists are everywhere. Facebook has just helped that. So, but it is a worry. So you would have soldiers possibly with that eudaimonistically related problem. Okay. But I think the fourth issue is more compelling, and it's really a rights-based critique. And it actually involves the link between this kind of person who is narcissistic and very powerful, and the way they would look at others, especially if cognitive enhancements were involved. So even Immanuel Kant talks about the fact that the foundation of human dignity is our reason and freedom, and I think we pretty freely associate the human worth with this capacity of reason. And there's a paper by Alan Buchanan that he wrote in, 2009. And we didn't read this as part of our research in 2009-10. I came upon it later in our seminar, I can't remember, probably about 4 years ago we read this. And his argument was, it was a paper called Moral Status in Human Enhancement. And in the paper, he actually looks at philosophically whether moral status of enhanced beings would be greater, and he concludes, no, it would not. But then he just mentions what he calls this, what do you call it, the practical worry. And he really doesn't develop this. And he basically says that given the association of human worth with reason and human worth with rights, enhanced beings, what he calls superhumans or post-humans, would look at their lessers as being less than human and having fewer rights. And therefore, this situation is just rife for human rights abuses. And I think if you look historically at the sources of human rights abuses, think of slavery, for example. I mean, this notion of superiority has been shown to be a problem before. So I don't know exactly how the technology could develop, but assuming that it could develop in this way, you would have a problem. And then the question becomes, well, how to manage this problem? And we can talk a little bit more about details, but you might want to limit this kind of enhancement to soldiers that really need it, and are a very small percentage of the military, like special forces, okay? Although that might be hard to keep in that box, and you might actually want to cognitively enhance your entire military. Okay, once you do that, then you've got the civil-military relations problem, where the military feels superior and is superior and ruling abusively the rest of society. So you solve that problem by releasing it to society. Assuming that these enhancements cost some money, then you might have a cognitively enhanced rich and military. You would want to solve that problem by giving these enhancements to everybody, but then you still have the rich nation, poor nation problem globally. So, I mean, ultimately, I think that the best solution would be to give these to everyone globally or nobody globally, but I think this is highly doubtful. And so the scenario I see is probably the one where rich nations all are cognitively enhanced, and then you have this global rich-poor problem exacerbated, more than it's been throughout history. So those are basically the four. And this last problem, this rights-related problem, as it relates to our perception of worth and rights, I think is the most worrisome to me.
Maybe this is an argument for universal conscription.
Yes.
I'm sure you can talk about that. Yeah, because I'd like to, everybody I've met in special forces is superior already. I don't know how much better you can make them. But what I wanted to ask, if I may, Bill, is there is a lot of talk about the burdens on warfighters now, and we know some of the people who are working on this question. Moral burdens that warfighters, young 19, 20, 21-year-olds face when they're in combat, these decisions they have to make, and how this may contribute to post-traumatic stress and so forth, or be exacerbated by PTSD. What happens if we can start putting these objects in people's heads, as you say, when they're out of the service? What's the decommissioning of these items? And what does that mean? I know there's a good argument that when you're in the armed forces, you basically pretty much give up all your rights except your right not to fulfill an illegal order, and maybe your right not to be a human subject in an experiment. Other than that, but it seems to me, does it exacerbate the burden potentially when you start taking stuff out of people's heads that has really made them superior in important ways?
Yeah, great question, Jonathan. So I should first note that I think, especially for the near future, it's highly unlikely we will use any implanted technology for operational performance improvement. That's for both practical reasons and for ethical reasons, right? So I foresee that technology mostly being used to address deficits that have been acquired as a result of combat injury. So, for example, most of the work done in DARPA's Biological Technologies Office is around remediating injuries sustained during combat, as you noted earlier. That includes things like subnets, which is a program that looks at using small implanted multi-input, multi-output modules to jump the cleft, if you will, for parts of the brain that have been damaged as a result of warfighting. Right? If you have hippocampal damage, for instance, you might have problems retrieving short-term memory, and what if I could put a small Gmo device in the affected area to restore hippocampal functioning so that you can access memories, right? Very basic biological needs that we have as people. Having said that, I agree with one of the panelists this morning who talked about how there's relatively little that's new under the sun. Like you, I stand in awe of our warfighters, our soldiers, sailors, airmen and women, and Marines. I think they do have fantastic capacities, and they have been enhanced, like I suspect most of this audience has been, by training, education, graduate school, right? Many of you know 100 times more about the law and possess 100 times more capacity to make an eloquent argument in a courtroom or write a tight lawyerly brief than I ever will. And you will never lose that. So insofar as there are issues of justice that come about from the obtaining of additional capacity, from training, education, and circumstance, those same moral issues will apply even for these new technologies, and I don't think that they're that radically different. My solution would probably follow along the lines of Ed's. Keep in mind these 3 C's of character, consent, and consequence. Consider those 3 dimensions of moral evaluation. And when we look at our best ethicists of justice, like John Rawls, then we very quickly arrive that we need to think about things like a universal basic income, perhaps, or access to universal health care to some minimal degree in a democratically sanctioned process like we saw in Oregon State. And so I think when you combine these character, consent, consequence-oriented considerations, you quickly get to the need to realize that we probably ought to do a little bit more distribution of the capacities that exist presently, irrespective of how they're gained.
The one thing that occurs to me, though, is that never in history have we, well, assuming these undeveloped, the capacity differences between those who attend Ivy League schools and who don't are not as great as possibly in the future. If you are able to create a situation where human beings are 10 times as intelligent as the average, I think that has in it some possibilities that are somewhat new. Right now, I mean, to a degree, but not a radical degree, that the cognitive elites look down on those who are their inferiors. But they don't look at them as such either. Okay, but I think there is a possibility that given the increased difference in capacity, that might happen. It's just something to watch. I don't know. I mean, this is empirical, it gets into psychology, but I think there's enough worry based on how human beings feel and think to worry.
It's interesting. Can I just say, sometimes.
Yeah, I think one of the things that where we're going in this conversation is interesting because in a survey that was done just a couple of years ago by MIT, and many of you have seen this, the public was asked whether you thought that treatment, genetic engineering treatment was acceptable, and whether you thought enhancement was acceptable. And as you can imagine, something like 26% thought enhancement was okay, only 26%. But in treatment, still it was only 46% treatment. And I think one of the ways I think we can change that perception is to talk about, and I'm taking this process from law, because we find analogies in law to emerging technologies when we talk about it, is a moral analogy. And I think if we start to talk about these enhancements, like glasses, nobody has a problem with wearing glasses. And that is really, in my opinion, isn't that morally analogous? You're enhancing your eyes with glasses, a device, or you're enhancing it genetically. And I think we need to start thinking about this as a moral analogy so that it's more understandable. With these new technologies, this won't be the last time we talk about a new technology. And we've got to find ways to make it, to communicate it to the public with, it's like this. It's no different than this morally. It's certainly different technologically, but morally, isn't it the same thing?
Well, one potential difference might be the fact that I can decide whether or not to put my glasses on or when I take them off when I want to use them. And Dr. Casper mentioned the issue of consent. And so what does that play in this process when it comes to performance enhancement? Should soldiers have this foisted upon them? Or is it necessary for them to consent? And is it even possible for them to consent to some of these enhancements?
Yeah, I think they should consent. I mean, whether or not it's informed consent is another question. Will we know all the effects that are going to occur, side effects? And also, as brought up in one of the articles that was on the website for this panel, well, within military organizations, there's organizational pressure. And also, just within the culture of, say, the U.S. military, there's a can-do attitude, okay? And people of a certain age get really caught up in that, and I think are likely to consent without really what they're doing.
I mean, we sort of.
So, it gets into freedom, I guess. Pressure.
Yeah, this is a great point. I'll come back over to you, but just to follow up, I don't know that it is so much concern about consent and its presence or its absence, because I think we've got the story right there. Of course consent is needed. It's needed presently for typical training programs. I'm free to leave while training at any point. I just tell my CEO I drop out. There might be a consequence that involves paying back some money, but so it goes. So consent is super important. I think we all agree with that. We have structures and issues in place that support it. What I worry about is this more subtle phenomenon, and it's my larger ethical worry actually about human performance and human technologies, is this creeping cultural phenomenon where, because our men and women in uniform are such go-getters, they're often spring-loaded to consent, where it is really incumbent upon you as a practitioner of the science to fully inform them about the limits of the technology or the approach. So I can't tell you how many times I had conversations with our special operations forces where I would display my latest wares from my development program and say, hey, look at this potential augmentation. They'd say, oh, can I use that tomorrow? And I would say, no, you can't. Please, dude, right? So you need to have some of these dude moments, more of those dude in our culture. And that is a little bit trickier process than just putting in place formal requirements for consent for training or enhancement.
So one last question.
And John,
Can I just want to make sure, we've already sort of faced an interesting problem with the anthrax vaccines that first go for, and interestingly bromide for prevention of nerve gas, responses to nerve gas exposure, when veterans coming back felt that they were not adequately briefed about the implications. And whether they were or not is a continuing argument, but letting people feel that they know the implications of what they're doing, despite their eagerness to embrace the next cool thing, is in the long-term interests of the forces.
Just a personal note on that. So I was activated in November 2003, just after finishing my PhD, to fly into Iraq and Afghanistan out of Kuwait for 2 years. And shortly before that, they said, you're going to have to take the anthrax shot sequence, 5 of them. Everyone did it. Damn right. And we were trained up and we're ready to go and give it to us. There have been some serious problems that emerged from people in my squadron. One is disability, retired, and other issues that converge. And so even with, and these are older reservists in their 40s, and we're not very well educated, so it's not just the youngsters.
If I could throw out one more question before we go to the audience. So that last question would be, when it comes to these enhancements, are there bright lines? Is there a place that we shouldn't go? Like, for example, editing memories. Is that
That's-
if we cross the line there? And so if I could just go down the panel and ask, what are your bright lines? If any. I'll start with Dr. Kessler.
Sure. So there are some principle-oriented bright lines linked to character and consequence. Right? So those include things like don't do anything to someone without asking them first and making sure that they understand what it is they're asking of them. Generally, don't do things to people that will make them dysfunctional as human beings. That's the character-oriented notion. Right? So most of my sleepless nights in service were about, am I asking people to do things that are going to make them less effective as friends or mothers or fathers, right? Those kinds of questions, your dark nights of the soul that you get, especially in decisions of command authority. So those are some semi-bright lines for me. Now, I want to add an important corollary. Most of the differences that we're talking about are differences of degree, not kind. So one of my bright lines is no germline modification. Yeah, let's not do genetic engineering, right? Bright line. And that was one I supported even as we set up our ethical, legal, and social implication review processes inside of DARPA, for instance. But on the other hand, intergenerational epigenetic change happens. So what I mean by that is that there are processes that happen right now, especially under stress and duress in those conditions, that will result in what are called methyl groups being attached to your DNA. That will change your DNA, and that will be reflected in any children you might have, what their DNA look like after the event. So there's a sense in which we already do genetic engineering by not taking into account epigenetic processes that influence the germline and population levels, especially when we cause great periods of stress and trauma for large groups of people. For instance. And so it goes for memory too. Memory is a reconstructive process. This is well-established cognitive science. So we all edit our memories in a sense every day. When we bother to recall one thing rather than another, that ossifies and changes the memory slightly so that 2 years from now, if you don't rehearse a memory from a significant event, you may no longer be able to access it, whereas other events that some might view as being trivial are central to your life because they're an important part of your story. So it's just a friendly reminder that even as we talk about augmentation, to keep in mind that many of these augmentations are ones of degree, not high.
Two come to mind, lines to me. The first I already mentioned, emotional enhancements that involve these soldiers that, decreasing their fear and increasing their aggressiveness. I think it's really dangerous for everybody involved. The second would be, and I was thinking about solutions to my problem about this abuse issue, and I thought, well, what about ethical enhancements? So that would be your solution, because everyone knows. But then, this brings up issues about, what's fulfilling about human life. It brings up issues related to the theodicy problem. What's the value of freedom, even if evil is going to exist as part of that equation. So I don't know if that's a bright line, but it concerns me.
Dr. Sutton?
Yes. Yes, this is going to sound like science fiction, but as a law professor, we write problems on exams that are often fiction. But the one that I think really bothers me is I think we're already even past your concern about human germline gene editing because of the announcement in China with editing. So if it's going on, it's possible. So my concern is that two things. One, the National Academy has opened the door to treatment with gene editing. They said you should proceed with caution, but that doesn't mean that you can't do it without proper oversight. That was their determination from their 2017 report. So to me, that was open. And once you open the door, then you've got lots of space from there. They have opened the door. They didn't open the door to human germline editing. as for non-treatment purposes, but that's just the next step. So my concern is several steps away from here. We've been able to create animal models for everything, but there will come a day when we cannot create an animal model. And there will be a question about whether we're going to be able to experiment on humans. I know this sounds like science fiction, but that would be the next step. And if someone in their wisdom says, well, let's say we have so many environmental stresses, for example, we really need to enhance humans to be able to adapt faster. I'm saying these are a set of circumstances that we might imagine. And then we're faced with balancing the future of human existence with experimenting on humans. And that's the sort of thing that might force us to say, maybe, okay, yes. And then we have a whole group of humans that are, let's say, damaged from human genetic experiments. And we've created a whole class of people that we never really wanted to do, unintended consequences of human survival. Maybe we need to do these experiments for people that, if we said, if we could only just adjust this part of the gene, then these people could live on the moon or Mars, for example. We're talking about travel and people living and colonizing other planets. This is very science fiction sounding, I know, but this is maybe 10 steps beyond what we're talking about today that could be possible. I think any sort of experimentation on humans would definitely be that one.
What's the question? Yeah, I'm not too good at bright lines. So I don't know what editing memory really means. Psychotherapists, when they're working with people who have had traumatic experiences, don't really edit memories. They help people to manage their bad memories. And I think actually life really requires us to figure out how to use our bad experiences. And I think, so lawyers have said to me, we don't want our witnesses to forget what they witnessed. It's hard enough to get them to remember what they witnessed. And I think we have a moral responsibility to learn from the mistakes we made, personally and culturally. So no elimination of memory, thank you very much. Let's figure out how to manage it better and learn from it.
With that, I will open it up to the audience. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I have no idea of the technical feasibility of this, but this is sort of more in the nature of thought experiment. As everyone knows, the challenge in asymmetric conflict is sometimes the tendency to be insufficiently sensitive to the prospect of innocent civilian casualties, sort of force protection, a variety of sorts of mechanisms in place, group loyalty, that sort of thing. Suppose that there could be an enhancement that increases sensitivity to or aversion to civilian casualties. Ed suggested earlier, well, maybe something that would decrease inhibitions, increase aggressiveness might be a bright line. What about something like this? Would there be any problem, at least in principle, with that, or would that interfere with the tolerance of civilian life?
Yeah, I don't know what that would exactly look like.
I don't either.
I mean, I know they talked about the fact that there's certain parts of your brain and your emotions that are activated when you're thinking about pushing the family off the bridge.
Right.
You know, so maybe that kind of enhancement of that part of the brain. Sure, possibly, but then I do wonder what the result would be on one's freedom. I mean, but then that gets into sticky questions like, well, so what? Don't you want people to be compelled to be just and charitable? So that's as far as I can go. Those are attractive, but I wonder about the inconceivable problems.
To pile on it, I think that psychopharmacological approaches to these problems are generally blunt instruments and aren't going to work for a myriad of both practical and moral reasons. But I think what you just suggested is a type of moral education.
Yeah.
And I hope we would do that. And I hope Ed does. I know you do. Thank you for doing that, Ed. I did it for a few years teaching professional ethics at the Air Force Academy as well. It's important. And the particular case that you're talking about does highlight these external influences on how we reason as well. In the trolley problem and the footbridge problem that you were both referring to, what happens there is if you describe a situation as involving interpersonal contact, the networks in the brain that deal with theory of mind, the ability I have to make inferences about what we're thinking, come online. And that gives me that immediate icky reaction, like, oh, of course I don't want to push the child off the bridge to save 5 other children. On the other hand, if I describe almost that exact same scenario, setting aside some principle of double effect niceties, so don't jump on me yet, then as being one where I push a lever and one child is struck rather than 5 by the train, then there, very different neural networks are brought online. They're affiliated with calculation of consequence and working memory. I can see that difference in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner. And that is a consequence, that difference in judgment, when you think it is permissible to kill for the greater good, let's not mince words, was influenced by the narrative frame I used to describe it. And that influenced your brain and your moral sensitivity.
So with that knowledge, particularly the developments in neuroscience, you know this,
Yeah.
really well, the developments in neuroscience and the relationship of neural structures to moral sensibilities, you could imagine training or education techniques that draw on that, maybe to manipulate the environment in a way that certain sorts of affective responses are generated, right?
Yeah.
Now, I use the word manipulation in a non-pejorative sense, but would that fall within the bounds of what's appropriate?
I think that's
the
a kind
individual
of
may not
character
be.
development, the way you described it.
Say again?
I think that's a kind of character development, what you just described. And of course, all of our intuitions here are pumped by science fiction and dystopia and utopia. But it makes me think of the end of Clockwork Orange, right? That's not what I'm advocating. But I am advocating what already supposedly distinguishes the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy and West Point, namely that they are character development institutions, not just technical trade schools. Why don't we just send everybody to MIT, right, if we want superior engineers? It's that we claim that by controlling the environment in which the cadets, the midshipmen, the zoomies grow up for those 4 years, we change the things they want to seek, their motivations, their sensitivities. And so those things are happening. Back in the day, whenever we were first streaming, learning to download music, you could watch at the time, it was still a murky legal issue, is my understanding, not being lawyers. The downloads increase at night as the cadets would go home and go back to their dorms and start to download music. And we were starting to notice these interesting interactions between the environments and the cadets' behavior. Here's another one, by the way, not just the access to technology that makes people steal when they might not otherwise, right? Think about how much sleep you get. There is almost a linear correlation between the likelihood that you would have been involved in an honor incident at one of the academies and how much sleep you got. So if I wanted to engineer an institution that taught people how to have the right attitudes about an impending test, it would be study early, get more sleep. Those things are just as much character education as an admonition and a finger waving to not cheat on an exam. And those things we already influence.
There are those who argue that taking people out of the loop is the way to deal with this problem.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
you write laws on conflict into the software.
Yes. So Dr. Sutton was talking about how people will accept glasses but not what they see as enhancement or that kind of thing. And you were talking about narrative framing. And what I thought of was the buzz now about GMO foods, right? Genetically modified food. People hear that and they're like, I don't want it, it's terrible, this. But frankly, taking one apple branch and grafting it with another is genetic modifying, but somehow that's more acceptable and palatable. So is this a vocabulary issue? Should, instead of, the GMO sense, that label alone seems to put people off. If some of this is inevitable and will happen and is happening, is it still early enough from a messaging standpoint and a framing standpoint that maybe we should have a different vocabulary we use in talking about this in a more public way? Because scientists may understand it and legal ethicists may understand some of it, but the general messaging for public attitude purposes, should we be using a different vocabulary?
Yes,
For anyone who wants to answer.
I think we should be speaking in analogies and saying it's like glasses or something like that. I think the root of the problem is the inability for people to really accurately determine risk perception. And we've seen that people Basically, people think of risk as 50-50. They can't really see the 1 to 100% risk. They either know 1 in 100 or 50-50, and they don't know much in between. So I think they did a better job showing the risk. And sometimes the best way to show risk is comparatively. So eating a GMO vegetable is less risky than being struck by lightning. I mean, that might be one way of explaining it. But I think analogies are really a good way to explain it to people. Maybe we should do that more.
The terminology also often has cultural impetus. So a lot of anti-GMO stuff is rooted also in anti-capitalism and cultural statements, particularly in Europe. You know, so there's a sociology to language also that isn't so easy to reform. When people who were in stem cell biology were trying to get the language of cloning replaced with somatic cell nuclear transfer, that didn't work.
Yes, right here.
Thank you so much for the wonderful panel. I want to try to connect this panel to the first panel we had today. So if we can enhance human to be as fast and as accurate as we might want autonomous weapons to be, might that be, in a sense, something that can replace autonomous weapons and can be a good idea? And then the other question is close to what Professor Barrett was talking about. Would those people, those enhanced people, exercise the same judgment that we would want to exercise people on the loop in this situation if we're comparing that with autonomous weapons?
Again, I guess I would just have to just think that that's an empirical question. I just don't know exactly, but I'm wondering whether or not their sense of superiority would affect their moral judgments in those situations against unenhanced adversaries, civilians, say, language for an issue. So that worries me. I mean, it's a nice solution to avoid the laws, but then you create some problems with the human beings too. But then again, if we get admin stuff, it won't happen. Okay.
There's a question here. Yes, sir.
I have a great panel, and I'd like to sort of ask a pointed question to Professor Moreno. I know Dr. Casebear, as a psychiatrist, retired Army General, who advised the senior leadership a lot, it has been perplexing to me that what I perceive as a disconnect. So the work that you've talked about in terms of cognitive enhancement and feedback loops, which, by the way, we saw in the 70s in terms of neurofeedback and work in EEG, it does not seem to have at all entered into the arena of treatment of our soldiers, service members who have suffered have post-concussion symptoms and from IED blasts. In fact, those worlds seem very siloed. To me, as a clinician, it looks like an ethical lapse. It looks like a programmatic lapse. But perhaps there's something that I would ask you to talk about that explains it. Because there's a lot that we can do. You know, these individuals who've had IED blasts fundamentally suffer with problems in cognition, attention, concentration, and memory. They have sleep problems, and they have serious problems with irritability and controlling it. And of course, you know, we really don't have any new diagnostics or any new treatments. And there might have been some promising opportunities in the work that you did.
Well, I mean, the BRAIN initiative is, I think, politically motivated to get to some of the problems that you're talking about. I can't speak to whether there have been failures in failure to focus on promising areas by DARPA, maybe Bill King. that come from, I'm going to load it on him, that could be gleaned from some of the work on EEG, some of which was done here, as you probably remember, in the 60s and 70s.
Thank you for your service, sir. I appreciate it. No, I think your point's well taken. Our research institutions have tried to dig in on this problem. A lot of the work's been preventative with things like the glass gauge program, right, that did get fielded where you had a sensor on your helmet that would give you an early warning that you need to go talk to a doc because you might have been exposed to a blast event that would generate preclinical symptoms, right, that you wouldn't be aware of. So that helps. And also with restoration in kind of the worst of cases with some of the subnets programs, for instance, that I mentioned. The one thing I would say, and I'll speak out of turn as a human being, to be quite frank. I understand that there are structural and institutional reasons related to allocation of resources that might be preventing us from helping people who need help. But I think it is too bad that the gold standard that we have presently for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, namely some types of cognitive behavioral therapy, is not covered by TRICARE. And you ask me, if you give me enough beer, why it is that TRICARE doesn't cover that. I suspect it's because it would bankrupt TRICARE to do so. I'll leave it at that.
And Steve and I think we've talked about this. That's really interesting because the method of choice after World War II was group therapy.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't, you know, we can argue about how effective that was, but that was also because of resource problems. There weren't enough psychologists to go one-on-one.
Yes, question?
You're at the law school today, so I have to ask you a legal question. In the U.S., we have a reasonable man doctrine, and generally we don't think about individual characteristics of individuals in applying that doctrine unless they're found to be clinically insane. And I was wondering if we have a new class of people that has experienced emotional or cognitive enhancement, if we expect those types of considerations to be included in the reasonable man doctrine. And for the non-lawyers in the room, I'm asking if people who experience these enhancements should be held to the same expectations that we generally have for people in our society to behave in a certain way.
Well, I know what Professor Morse would say. He's not here, is he? Nah. Doesn't make any difference from a legal standpoint.
That was really good for non-lawyers.
Thank you. Because I heard Steve Morse yell at me about this.
No, I think you would still have the reasonable person standard for that because that shouldn't really affect whether they should take more risky behavior or not to endanger someone else or stand when they see some danger and not move out of the way. I think they should still have at least that same standard. I think the question is, should they be held to a higher standard? And I don't think that would not be the case either. I think it would still be a reasonable person standard.
If a person was enhanced to be more aggressive, they shouldn't be held to, that shouldn't be...
I think that would mitigate the responsibility in some ways. On the other hand, I mean, as much as culpability is linked to knowledge of facts, they might be, more culpable.
It depends if you're talking about a civil or a criminal action. If you're talking about criminal, then that would be a defense. If you're talking about civil and you're talking about tort there, there's a whole range of behaviors already. And because you act aggressively or reckless, that doesn't absolve you of liability, even if you can show mitigating circumstances, like I have an issue that prevents me from controlling my aggressiveness, and that's a mitigating issue.
The accountability could be to whoever is in the chain that created your characteristic. So Bill put some chips in your head to make you a more aggressive warfighter. Turns out he puts them in the wrong place, and you're really nuts.
And
Whose fault is that?
See, I think that could be a product liability issue.
Not a practitioner's problem.
It gets him up, though, too.
I think, there's a journal article there, right there, though. That's a really
All right, last question. Last question. Do we have? Yes, sir.
I hope I'm able to formulate this properly. Perhaps it belongs more to the first panel. So my question is, in regards to the President's decision to launch our nuclear arsenal. And in that regard, we talked about, I think, ethical enhancement, and we all laughed at that. Would it be possible at some point in time, perhaps, in that decision-making process, that somehow we incorporate the considerations, for instance, for international humanitarian law, proportionality, for collateral damage, and make that decision to actually launch a better decision.
I'm assuming that order, like any other order that a president would be considered and would have a bunch of lawyers around him or her helping them understand the implications, including likely mortality.
Probably, but again, it would be his or her final decision, right? So,
indeed, there's a chain of command. There's friction, but there's a chain of command.
I mean, if for the appointment of philosophical ethicists, that'd be great. But I'm just not sure whether we're competent to know about effects. That's what the military does better than a philosophical ethicist. But as much as there are people, need to be people reminding decision makers of the rules, that makes a lot of sense to me.
And those people could be people of wisdom. So those are people whose judgment has been enhanced by decades of experience and the right kind of character development and education. Or they might be artificial moral decision reasoning aids. Right? So I think one of our failures as an institution is that we haven't yet built an artificial conscience that might, in a sense, be able to grab a hold of those dimensions of moral sensitivity, motivation, judgment, and skill that Jim Russ talks about to provide us some advice when our backs are against the wall so that we don't make a decision we later regret.
So, Dr. Strangelove, Doomsday Machine, wouldn't have gone ahead and would have been a different ending to the movie. You've been able to build some of these considerations into this.
I think this was a fantastic panel, and I'd ask you to join me.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Welsh. I'm the Executive Director here at the Center for Ethics and Rule of Law. So if any of you are new to coming to our sessions, this is the fourth session that we've had today on the ethical challenges in the development of new weaponry. It's been a great day so far, and we know it's going to continue with our great panelists that we have here, and concluding with the keynote by General Votel. So I'd like to take a minute just to introduce our panelist and moderator. Professor, to the right, Professor Mitt Regan is the McDevitt Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the Center on the Legal Profession and Co-Director of the Center on National Security and the Law at the Georgetown University Law Center. His work focuses on international law, national security, international human rights, and legal and military ethics. Professor Margaret Kosol is an Associate Professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology and the San Nunn School of International Affairs. Her research explores the relationships among technology, strategy, and governance. She is the author of Nanotechnology for Chemical and Biological Defense, which explores scenarios and strategies regarding the benefits and potential proliferation threats of nanotechnology and other emerging sciences in international security. Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Korpela is the Associate Professor and Director of Robotics Research of the Robotics Research Center at the United States Military Academy at West Point. An active duty Army officer, Lieutenant Corporal Korpela has been deployed twice to Iraq, once to Afghanistan, and served in various command and staff positions. As a researcher, he has coordinated research projects and grants across the U.S. Department of Defense, academia, and industry in the fields of robotics control and autonomy, and he's authored and co-authored over 35 scientific and professional papers. And last, Mr. Louis Del Monte is the CEO of Del Monte & Associates, Inc. He's a best-selling author and award-winning physicist. For over 30 years, he was a leader in the development of microelectronics and sensors for IBM and Honeywell, and he published 4 best-selling, critically acclaimed books, including Nano Weapons, A Growing Threat to Humanity. So we look forward to a great panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to all your hard work in helping put this terrific event together. This is, of course, the last panel of the day, and I think you'll find pretty quickly that there are a lot of intersections with the panels that have preceded us. But I want to start first just with laying some groundwork, basic groundwork, and that is, what exactly is nanotechnology, right? The immediate intuition is, well, it's something that's really small, okay? But there is actually more to it than that. Who would like to weigh in on that? You offer a definition in your book on nano weapons. There may be others who add or refine that.
The definition I used came from the United States National Nanotechnology Initiative, which was started in 2000 under President Clinton. And they defined nanotechnology as the science, engineering, and technology conducted at the nanoscale, which is 1 to 100 nanometers. Now, to put that in perspective, so we get an idea of this, if you took a human hair, not the length of the hair, but the diameter of the hair, it's about 100,000 nanometers. So when we talk about the nanoscale being 1 to 100, the largest dimension of nanotechnology is 1/1000th the diameter of a human hair. So that's what we're dealing with.
Okay. Chris, Maggie, did you want to add any other elements to that? Okay, so we're good so far. Okay, so we know, your intuition is right. Things that are really small. All right. Now, are there other characteristics other than simply size with respect to nanotechnology that are distinctive in this area? Any sort of characteristics or features of things at the nano level as opposed to at a larger level?
So from a technical perspective, one of the things when one is looking to differentiate nanotechnology from macro scale phenomena is that you are looking for some of these different properties to emerge. Sometimes they're optical properties. For example, we're all familiar with gold being a yellowish color. Well, if you make gold nanoparticles that are of a specific shape, one shape is red, another shape appears as if it is kind of a dark blue. So this is what differentiates, one of the pieces that differentiates nanotechnology from the macro scale, is that when one gets to this level, you see different properties emerge than what we're often familiar with. Now this is not, we're not talking about quantum properties. That's another level down. This is also, the nanoscale is also where many of the processes, the biological or the biochemical processes that go on in the human body occur. So if you're looking at the active site inside hemoglobin, that molecule that enables you to breathe, bring in oxygen, take out the waste products, the active site, the chemical compound, is about 10 nanometers. So it's bigger than individual molecules, but it's smaller than most biological entities.
Okay. Chris?
So for, in addition to size, of course we look at, swap, right? So we look at the weight and power. And I think on this scale, one of the biggest, the difficulties, of course, is power. So if it's not a biological agent, trying to power something to this scale is incredibly difficult. I mean, I've been a part of a number of technology alliances. Actually, Penn is involved with many of these research efforts. So there's a micro-autonomous systems effort. There's a robotics collaborative technology alliance that are really trying to, of course, get at these, this would be palm size and maybe insect-like systems. So not quite on the nanoscale, but even something that's going to fit into your hand. When we look at the weight and the power issues that we're dealing with are it's incredibly difficult. So trying to develop something that's going to have the kind of endurance that you need, and also something that's going to be able to have the onboard sensing and the ability to communicate. I mean, it's again in the earlier panel we were talking about, it's hard for a small vehicle to operate in an environment like this, and of course as we get down to these scales, it's incredibly difficult.
So one other concept you run across is surface to volume ratio. What exactly is that? Could you explain? how that is significant with respect to nanotechnology?
So reactions go on at the surface areas where there are dangling bonds. So if you've got a larger surface area, you just can have a more efficient catalyst. And often catalysts do have implications in the context of some of the things we're eventually getting to. For example, among the Department of Defense, or within the Department of Defense, the single area that has deployed nanotechnology, explicitly calling it out as nanotechnology rather than embedded within electronics or for material properties, is using nano-enabled decontaminants for chemical and biological agents. And again, it is because this phenomena where it's just because you've got a much greater surface area, you can use much less, potentially, of a decontaminant. And also, you can either have gentler decontaminants, or you can have decontaminants that might not damage critically an F-22 or an F-35, because those are really expensive.
Okay, and that brings up, that example is very helpful. So what are some of the applications we've seen? Let's leave weapons aside for the moment. There are a lot of applications I think that most people would regard as beneficial. Where are we headed in that direction, Lou?
Well, when I took a look at nanobots, that was one example.
And what exactly is a nanobot?
Okay, in theory, it's a nanobot that is a product of nanotechnology. So it's a tiny robot. So they call it a nanobot. And if you look at weapons, you can't find any. You will not be able to find nanobots existing as weapons. You go to the medical profession, and they're doing an enormous amount of work with nanobots. And it goes everything from to even the cure of cancer. And we're not talking small studies. Pfizer has partnered with one of the leading researchers in the field, and they're doing human trials using nanobots, essentially folded DNA that has a drug within it. The DNA finds the cell, so it goes right to the cancerous cell, opens up, the drug comes out, attacks that one cell, and so you don't get the massive destruction that the body goes through in chemotherapy. And they're finding, they've done different, I would say, anecdotal studies, humans nonetheless, that in one study, 14 out of 16 terminally ill patients were actually cured. Cancer went into remission.
So this is a very targeted sort of
a targeted
treatment.
Approach.
Right, and let me just ask, and then any of you can answer this, with something like that, so do we have then essentially something that is programmed to recognize a certain DNA or some sort of cellular structure, and then once recognizes it, takes certain action, right? So would we say that that is AI enabled?
No.
In a way? Or is that still in the, that's because there's not a learning?
Because so there are, nanotechnology is not a discrete homogeneous entity. So we have to talk in generalisms. As we're talking about these medical applications, you leverage a surface protein that is appended to something, can be a magnetic nanoparticle, something that has some unique capabilities to hone in on these. It literally is the surface protein that recognizes a cancer cell, one of the ways that this can be done. This is the same thing that's in pregnancy, the same basis that's in pregnancy tests. So it's a surface antigen recognition. A nanoformulation of Taxol was the first FDA approved medical application of nanotechnology. In 1997, then recently retired Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, David Jeremiah, made a comment that molecular manufacturing, nanotechnology, was going to disrupt the balance of power, challenge nuclear weapons in terms of balance of power. That's 1997, 20 years later, when I'm teaching about, it's usually science, technology, international affairs, and national security, I'll often ask, so what do you think is the single biggest market for nanotechnology? And people talk about biomedical, which are certainly our applications. People talk about computers. You're looking at trying to get past the Moore's Law limitations. People will often mention applications in coatings or materials. The single largest market for nanotechnology is health and beauty aids. Again, hey, I'm a diehard capitalist, so that's awesome, but that does not make it a strategic area in that sense. And I'm being a little quippish, but not too much. And those of us who are of a certain age, we remember when it used to be that sunscreen would be big white stripes because that was the zinc oxide at macro scale. Well, now zinc oxide is nanoscale, so it is clear to light, which is a great example of these properties that are different.
Yeah. All right, so if we move then to military applications. So Chris, I assume that the military is looking to and drawing upon some of these uses that have just been described, at least some of the principles, right, in their application. What are some of the ways in which items at the nanoscale, the nanotechnology, can be of assistance? And I realize it's a very broad range.
Sure.
Let's start with the more sort of passive uses, how that can be helpful.
So if we increase, if we go from 1/1000th of a human hair, maybe just a little bit larger, I can envision cooperative capabilities between we'll call them nano agents or nanobots, right, that are going to be trying to implement some type of behavior, right? So and then that could apply to a number of operational contexts. So if it is if it's a defensive manner, we are looking. And again, these are palm-sized systems, but obviously we could, as the technology improves, we'll get much smaller. But so swarming capabilities to intercept, if it's incoming, munitions and rockets and other types of effects that we're trying to, maybe do perimeter security or some kind of defensive type mission. So I can see as we get as we improve the capabilities of these, we'll say, of these particles, and then their ability to interact with one another, and then to give it a mission set if it is to, if there's an active shooter. So we want them, right. Maybe they will intercept rounds or even overwhelm, somehow overwhelm the shooter. So those are just maybe a couple of defensive applications I can think of.
Okay, and what's the advantage of having something at the nano level?
Of course, with when you get to that small of scale, the ability of it to be detected is much harder, right? To be, and again, this gets into, of course, if we're having these small agents that are acting in a anti-personnel manner, there could be, obviously we can get into the legal and ethical dimensions, but really where something on that scale that could be deployed to take out a potential bad actor in if it's in a hostage crisis or hostage situation, or we do not want to call in an airstrike and we want to take out a high value target, then we can deploy something on that scale that would target that individual and not affect others.
And there would be sensors on that so that it would detect or respond to some signature?
Right, so there could, maybe I could envision some type of designator like we do now with precision guided munitions, if it's some kind of laser designator, and or that you're going to somehow illuminate or tag that potential target, that then these nanoparticles would then try to attempt to engage that individual. And it could be, and we could also envision scenarios where they're just going to be incapacitated, right? So there's a lot of non-lethal or less than lethal options I think that we can employ, whereas in a high stress environment, let's say if we're room clearing, and with say it's a team going into clear a room, they really don't have that option of a non-lethal effect, right? They need to ensure that lethal force is used to protect their own team. So there could be some options for non-lethal.
Okay. Now, Maggie, you've written a book on biological and chemical nanotechnology. Could you describe some of the kinds of applications in that context? I mean, that obviously draws on what we've been discussing earlier today.
Certainly, and that was a project that came out of time when I was serving in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, more years than I want to admit now. And we were looking at how could nanotechnology be used as a revolutionary technology to enable countermeasures, whether that be post-exposure, so that means therapeutics, or pre-exposure vaccines. I already mentioned the decontaminants, personal protective gear, group protective gear, so any of those types of applications. And then within that book, we also looked at some of the proliferation scenarios. And one of the pieces that in the proliferation scenarios is critically important to me is that I like to say there's nothing that is referencing the Journal of Irreproducible Results. So I go through these technical based leveraging cutting edge science 10 years ago to develop ways that you might think about it being possible for a nation state to circumvent something like our protective, we already mentioned the anthrax vaccine, so to get around the anthrax vaccine. My book that's coming out in a couple months, one of the things we're talking about that is sort of pushing forward is thinking about metamaterials. And metamaterials is a name that's given to specific nanomaterials that have what's called a negative index of refraction. So you bend light. And this is looking at, well, what happens if we start to have these capabilities? So, okay, so, General H.R. McMaster at one point quipped about, I don't want invisible tanks. Well, is this going to give us invisible tanks? And goes through and does the assessment looking mostly through a political science lens of international security. And if you go through and say, how is this going to affect international stability, particularly these capabilities that are not here now? I mean, you can Google some of these cloaks, and yes, you can do an individual, but not for any type of deployed applications. That working through the implications on a strategic level, this type of technology is likely to benefit asymmetric actors, particularly individuals or groups that want to infiltrate a state. For example, nuclear smugglers. So this is the sort of the next piece that, moving beyond the technical side, which is what does this mean from an international security perspective, and then also thinking about the ethics and the moral and the legal implications.
Okay, so this is the so-called invisibility cloak possibility, yes, right? That you're able to just by virtue of the way the eye perceives something that it literally can't.
Literally bends
visible, visible, right?
You could also bend heat. So if you're trying to avoid IR detection.
Right. Okay. So one of the other concepts that's discussed a lot with respect to nanotechnology is swarms, and we've already begun to discuss it. Chris, can you delve down a little deeper into this phenomenon of swarms? Sure. and tell us exactly what are the characteristics and challenges?
We've been actually working with swarms for at least since 2015. So DARPA came to us, and we actually had a Service Academy Swarm Challenge. So each of the Army, Air Force, and Navy, the three service academies, basically deployed a mix of flying wings and quadcopters. So again, not on the nano scale, but these were legitimate swarms that were doing an aerial dogfight, if you want to think of it in that manner. And it was all virtual weapons, so based on the position of the vehicle and its and the range, and if you issued a fire command, and then if the adversary's vehicle was in range, then that system was taken out. So really trying to get at, of course, is the best way to combat a swarm is with, or a counter swarm is with another swarm potentially. So that's really trying to look at those aspects, and then having something that will can mimic nature, where if it's we'll say it's self-healing, right? So we lose agents, right? Or it can adapt to those lost agents or those lost links, that it can provide really communication relays and basically intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance information back to the users. You can imagine these were tens of vehicles. Now we're in the 2,000 to 3,000 vehicle scale. In a few years, let's say 10,000. And then who knows? In 5 years from now, we've got hundreds of thousands of vehicles and what the sizes are. So there's there's many, of course. So I was talking about the fob security example. We could use these in an offensive manner. We could, there's many, many good applications.
Could you imagine a swarm of, I'll call them agents, on the nano level, then, that would have the capability of some sort of coordination?
I would envision, absolutely. Just, at the
At the nano level?
well, not now. We're talking about we're in if something in the bloodstream, that was, is it feasible? Yeah, that's to be determined, right? But I think it's as the same problems I talked about earlier with size, weight, and power. It becomes increasingly more difficult at that level.
Right?
So some of you may have read Michael Crichton's book a few years ago, Prey, which was about nanoswarms. So, what Chris is talking about in the real world stuff may leverage nanotechnology, but these are bigger. These are on the micron or larger size. When you start talking about the kind of scenarios that Crichton puts forward, I say the ultimate countermeasure is you walk faster.
Or run.
Well, or run, get on your scooter, whatever. Air is a fluid. And if you're moving through that fluid and you are of a comparable size, this is called Reynolds number. Mechanical engineers know all about it. That it's like us trying to swim through molasses. So, again, this is where, are we talking about the scenario? What is a nano weapon versus what might be a weapon enabled by nanotechnology? These are really important distinctions because, what is a nano weapon? Well, I'm not really sure. We can't violate the laws of thermodynamics. At least not yet, or maybe DARPA's trying to work on it. If anybody can do it, they can.
So it's really, you see it basically as a transmission agent for various, let's say it's lethal operations, for various sorts of lethal agents that might have eventually the advantage of being very difficult to detect, right? And also, we'll get to this, I put it on the table now, attribution, it could be very difficult, I assume as well, right? As opposed to something that is distinctive, that would be distinctive and different from something in nature that we already are familiar with, right?
So one approach is, if you're thinking about it, are you looking at it in terms of what does it mimic, or so is this going to fall under the BWC? Is it going to fall under the certain convention? I'm not a lawyer. Conventional weapons. Where does it fall? And that certainly would be a route that I would propose looking to, rather than nano weapons. Lou hasn't gotten to add so.
Well, then you should do that right now.
Well, let's backtrack just a little bit. I believe that there are today weaponized nano weapons. Okay, and by that I mean it's particular to nano, and that's nanoparticles. All right. There's a lot of literature that says that nanoparticles can be toxic. And if you start with a toxic substance and you make the same amount of substance as nanoparticles, that substance becomes more toxic than, even though they weigh the same. It becomes more toxic. That's what the studies are showing.
It's more toxic because it's at the nano level?
Because it's at the nano. Because what can happen is that it can pass through membranes that its larger counterparts cannot pass through. So a toxic substance might not be able to get to your lungs, but a nanoparticle toxic substance may be able to get to your lungs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the issues. Mm-hmm. To the point of swarms, for example, one of the things we're putting a lot of emphasis on is lasers to deal with swarms. And the laser that was built for the US Ponce, that laser, uses nanotechnology. Yeah. So that is a nanotechnology with Nano Electronics. Mm-hmm. It's a nanotechnology enhanced weapon.
And in what way does it use nanotechnology?
The Nano Electronics.
Okay.
Okay, they couldn't shrink it to the size that they were able to do. Mm-hmm. You know, first I have to just say that this is based on my conclusions. The U.S. military is not publishing this.
You have to infer from...
You have to infer it from what's out there.
Right.
But the problem was shrinking it to the size where it could be mounted on a warship. And a lot of that was done through Nano Electronics. They were able to shrink it. Now, why are they pushing lasers? Because not nanobots coming at us, because they don't exist today, but swarm attacks by other weapons, where our weapons, for example, which would be missiles and what have you, are just not effective. Mm-hmm. So that's the rationale. That's why they're pushing it.
I see. So, Chris, is there also what I would call maybe a nano arms race going on? Are there sort of offensive, defensive responses, attack, counterattack?
Not in the circles that I'm familiar with and that I engage with, but I mean I think there's of course discussion on is there obviously an AI arms race? Is there are there are these types of capabilities causing race conditions where if we are developing a nano weapon or nanotechnology, then are potential adversaries trying to do the same but I mean from where I sit, I don't see the race that we see in other maybe in other areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
So to this question, if you go back to the mid-2000s, which in many ways was the height of nanobuzz, when Putin stepped back and Medvedev, which I can never pronounce his name, temporarily stepped forward, Putin made a comment about a nano arms race. The Iranian Majlis, which that's kind of like our versions of Congress critters, there were some comments made that multiple comments. The United States doesn't want Iran to have nuclear technology and nanotechnology. Again, in the mid-2000s, I did a survey at one point, and you found that something like 2/3 of the nations around the world had nanotechnology programs. Now, Burma was one of them. Burma's come a long way in the last 10 years, but what this indicates to me is, particularly in the 2000s, nanotechnology was an indicator of prestige. It was prestige and technical capability. And what I think we can do that is important, and again, look at this point, some of the nanobuzz is almost becoming history. And so it's, well, can we learn from the buzz about nanotechnology and some of the fears and some of the concerns, things that either were missed or that were overhyped that didn't come to play, and think about those in the context particularly of AI. Former colleague of mine who at the time was at the FDA, she used to like to say that nanotechnology was a way to get grant funding. I think it's probably AI now. Might still be cyber. You know, so this is where we were thinking about this idea of an arms race for nanotechnology. There's no evidence to suggest that there's a nanotechnological arms race. There certainly are, if you're looking at statements by elites, there certainly are this invocation of technical prominence and technical capability as being important. Now, when we start to talk about things like some of the things that Putin more recently discussed, which are getting a lot of attention, like hypersonics, you know, if you are going to start doing some of the considerations of hypersonics and some of his other, it was 6-panel cartoons, some of those are going to be leveraging the kind of electronics that Chris was talking about, which are enabled on the nanoscale. And again, it's because you can get, things are lighter, sometimes they are more robust. So all of these material factors are being leveraged.
Okay. So I want to ask, how could you envision that developments in AI and computer processing speed, right, would affect the development of nano weapons? I mean, to what extent would they be, in essence, a force multiplier? What sort of scenarios could we envision if those areas continue to develop?
So there was a great piece that just got published a couple weeks ago. There was a write-up in Chemical and Engineering News, which is the weekly news magazine of the American Chemical Society. And they were looking at the use of artificial intelligence to guide chemical reactions. And what they found was that there was bias in this. You know, we don't normally think about bias as being something in a chemical reaction. But that is a particularly fantastic example of where, at least when we are talking about weak AI or machine learning, that bias is critical. Maybe 6 months ago, there was a study that came out of, I think it was Australia. We're looking at racism in robots. And it was this idea that people, these are people problems, these are not technology problems. People looking at different colored robots imbued or imagined the characteristics of white robots were different than dark colored robots. So these are issues, and I'm using these as examples because if we're going to talk about AI for weapons development, certainly what you're going to get some crazy ideas, but mostly you're going to get ideas based on what is the state that's doing the programming. So if it's the United States, it's going to look like the United States strategic culture. If it's Russia, it's going to look like Russia's strategic culture. Chinese strategic culture. At least until we get, sort of a more general AI.
Okay. So I take it that, there's a lot of talk about self-driving cars, obviously. I take it that there potentially is the capability that nanoparticles could navigate various sorts of terrains, if you will, whether it's air or what have you. Right, and is that something that's already happening, or are they developing that capability now?
If you're asking me, no, that's not happening. But what I think would be, if you want to talk next decade,
yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to see drones the size of birds and potentially insects in the next decade. And that will require nanotechnology. And to Chris's point, it will require that we do a lot of work on power supplies to energize that type of drone.
Mm-hmm.
there is AI being developed, it was developed by DARPA, that allows a fly, a drone fly, to not run into walls and miss boxes, and so it flies around. The US Army published a paper on a drone fly in 2010. It was tethered. Now that was 2010, that's almost a decade ago. And I have to believe that when they published it, they were already far beyond that point. They don't normally publish their latest work. DARPA published papers about how they had solved the problem of drones inside buildings not running into boxes. Now, if you put those two things together, we may end up with drone flies that can fly into, for an example, a command center of an adversary and be the proverbial fly on the wall.
Right, right. So Chris, looking at it from the U.S. perspective, what sort of scenarios are most concerned looking forward if we're looking at potential adversary uses of nanotechnology?
Yeah, I mean, at the scale, it's, it would have to be, I mean, it's hard to imagine, being able to, deploy, large numbers of some type of, we'll just use a nanobot or a drone fly, for example, to that, that we wouldn't have a counter, a countermeasure for.
Would there be difficulties in detection? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially with that, so if there's, I'm just thinking of this room. Okay, so if there's, we have, drone flies are going through the ductwork, through the, through these passageways that none of us are able to, to get into. So of course, in an operational context, we could, imagine if it's doing, like, going back to the building clearing example, or conducting surveillance. So if we're, or they're trying to, conduct surveillance on us, and how do we detect, something of that size? How do we, how do we mitigate, and what are the countermeasures for that? So there's of course a number of scenarios. I would not be, I guess I'm not as concerned as the flash consequences when we talk about, if it's, cyber and anomalies and power grids, or if there's, autonomous weapons that are going, acting erratically. I think on that scale, I guess I don't have the concerns, but there's definitely the detection piece is problematic.
What about you? What sort? I mean, there's some scenarios in your book that are that raise some pretty significant concerns.
About drone flies?
Well, a variety of things. The attack on the nuclear power plant, that sort of thing. It's all speculative, I realize, but are there concerns that you have about the way the technology is going? I mean, you go so far as to say that it could be a threat, of human extinction.
The threat is the loss of control.
Yeah.
With any technology, that's a threat. Basically, if you look at the long out, the crystal ball stuff, in the third quarter of this century, Nick Bostrom of Oxford and Bueller said, well, we should be at the technical singularity, the point at which machines become more ingenious than humans. Okay. At that point, those machines could develop nanobots to the point that they could become a weapon. And nature has been using swarming tactics for millennia since we've been around. And basically, if you have billions of small nanobots, and each of them carries a small amount of, say, an acidic compound. Imagine that attacking a portion of a ship. And I think I might have used that in the book, but at that portion, with concentrating all those nanobots in that one area, looking way out, I'm not suggesting it exists today, but as a thought experiment, that swarming tactic could sink the ship.
And Maggie, what about you? Are there scenarios that you could envision? That
Oh, I can envision lots of scenarios. Your question asked, sort of what is the scenario that I see as most concern? And I would say of the possible scenarios and things that keep me up at night, nanotechnology and nano weapons is not one of them. Nuclear weapons, resurgent Russia, these are things that I have much greater, squirrels attacking the electrical grid. These are the things that I have a much greater concern about, frankly, information warfare. And if we are going to talk in the context of nanotechnology, the greater concern that I have is we are shifting away from investment in basic research. We have been for the last number of years, and if we want to have the capabilities, and ultimately for our military it's about the people, but if we want to have the asymmetric capabilities, you've got to have the basic research being done right now that will enable these capabilities 20 years from now. And there have been a whole bunch of different things that have happened, some intended, some not. Frankly, we do need to also address issues of historically the United States has benefited from immigrants. Even before the current administration, we were seeing a decline in foreign nationals coming to the United States to pursue higher education. National Academy of Sciences just came out with a report a couple weeks ago where somebody, and I don't know how they got this through the reviewers, but I love it, basically said every time somebody gets a PhD in a STEM field, we should staple a green card to their diploma. And I'm not sure I'd go quite that far, but certainly I think that there is some merit to thinking about this. So my concern has to do with us losing our capabilities in basic research because we are not funding those and we don't value it.
Okay, to the extent where there are concerns out there with respect to, let's say, nano weaponry in particular, are there existing legal provisions, regulations, whatever form they may take, conventions, statutes, what have you, that are adequate to address them? Do we need some additional kinds of regulatory measures? Or what's the situation now?
I would envision that these types of weapons would fall under the existing provisions that we already have. So if it's weapons review, weapons testing, if it's like we talked about this morning with test and evaluation and verification and validation, these types of weapons would go through the same process. If it's international maritime law and LOAC, right, with terms of proportionality, distinction, right. If a nano weapon is released and it indiscriminately kills non-combatants, then obviously it's not adhering to IHL. So those would have to. I think the current frameworks that we have are sufficient for a weapon system of this type.
Okay.
And specifically to things like biological and chemical weapons. I mean, first of all, with biological weapons, the current treaty is not adequate, regardless, but that, again, is historical reasons. But if you are looking at it from the text of the treaty, then yes, the general purpose criterion says that these would be covered. Now, the BWC, through its implementing support unit and some of its review conferences, the OPCW, Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, through its technical secretariat, has considered what do developments in nanotechnology mean for the treaties and the bureaucracy in the case of the OPCW, and I use that not in a pejorative way. What does it mean for them? Particularly with chemical weapons, as we move to the elimination of chemical weapons, which was a major part of that treaty, what is the next thing? So they are looking at this. Again, the problems with the international treaty aspects aren't really about the technology. It's about people, it's about international politics, it's about domestic politics. You know, we have this wonderful post-World War II array of agreements that need to either be strengthened, we need to think about them. We don't have the same world that we had post-World War II that enabled them. And these are challenges of politics more and people, more than technology.
So Lou, you suggested that there might, in addition to being enablers, there might be something as in the category of a distinctive nano weapon, right? Do you agree, though, that the existing regulatory framework would be sufficient to handle that?
Basically, I do. For example, for toxic nanoparticles, I think we should look at that the same way we look at chemical, biological weapons, and try to, if the treaty isn't complete, try to embrace it. Where nanotechnology enables a weapon, say a hyperglide missile, I think that needs to be addressed. I'm not sure that we have treaties that address hyperglide missiles or autonomous weapons, but it's not the nanotechnology, it's the weapon itself that needs to be addressed.
Okay, right. So this again reflective of the notion that these are primarily enablers, right?
Yeah.
And that so whatever principles we might want to apply or would be those that would apply with respect to chemical weapons, biological weapons,
right.
Ballistic missiles.
Yeah. Right, what I was going to say or regular conventional weapons as well. Yeah. So we've had these discussions on autonomous weapon systems, right? Where do we need different treaties and laws to cover those? And typically the argument is no, that that the existing laws are sufficient.
Right, right. So stepping back, what about just the potential effect of nanotechnology, nano weapons in particular, on global balance of power? You work in the School of International Relations, right? But I'll certainly pose the question to others. But Maggie, do you want to start? What's your sense of, is this, the proverbial cliched game changer?
No.
Okay. So what do you think?
No.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Elaborate.
If we're going to rack and stack the things that are likely to affect strategic stability, nanotechnology is not it.
Okay. Because?
Because it does not, and there is nothing that is there to cause the amount of damage or have the strategic significance of nuclear weapons.
What if there's an asymmetry in nano weapon capability?
In what sense?
Well, in a sense that one, let's say, nation state is much further along than the other, which means that it's able to deploy these, which means that detection is much more difficult in the target state, means that the effects themselves may mimic the effects of diseases or what have you, so there may not even be a sense that there's been, what the UN Charter would call an armed attack, and it's very difficult to attribute. I mean, wouldn't the nation that has the advanced nanotechnology then be at a potential advantage?
It certainly could be at a potential advantage, but we see that currently the United States has technical advantages over everyone. So what did the insurgents in Iraq do in the mid-2000s? They started co-opting civilian infrastructure for IEDs. At one point, that was the single largest killer of American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, mostly ground troops. But we were able to deal with it. So it did not affect the balance of power. Would it be painful? Would it be something that countermeasures would need to be developed for? Absolutely, but not a balance of power in the grand international scheme.
Okay, Chris?
Right. I agree. I see the same capability or the same benefits from if it's stealth, if it's precision-guided munitions, a nuclear weapon, that those capabilities that we've seen over really the last 50, 70 years have had a more significant impact, we'll say, in potential arms races than nanotechnology. And not that we may not get there, 10, 50 years from now, but at least in the current operating environment, I don't see the disruption.
Okay, right. So Lou, let me start with you in posing this question, and that is, what are the major ethical issues, ethical concerns?
What are
What are the major ethical issues or concerns we should be thinking about now with respect to nanoweapons?
Well, fundamentally, when I looked at it as a danger to humanity, I was looking at the control issues. And I wasn't looking at it today, okay, because we don't have that type of issue. But if you look at it, say, and I was looking at the future of warfare. So if you look at it in the third quarter of this century, and if we do develop nanobots, controlling those nanobots is going to be very problematic, similar to controlling viruses. And that was one of my concerns. So I raised the general question is that could we develop this technology continually without endangering humanity? And my concern has been that as we develop new technology, we often exploit it in warfare long before we understand the ramifications of that technology.
Okay. So are there things we could be doing now to try to address that?
Well, the most ubiquitous nano right now is Nano Electronics. I would say half the people in this room are using it right now. It's in your computers. It's made by Intel. They're making 7 nanometer lithography. And why is that good? Because it's very fast, uses very little power. So it's a good thing. Now, as that nano electronics gets put into hyperglide missiles, autonomous weapons, our 5th and 6th generation fighter planes, drones, etc., then that becomes the issue to worry about. Near term, I'm worried about the same things that both Margaret and Chris talked about. Long term, though, I think we have other concerns to look at.
Okay. Chris, let me come back to you then on that.
Well, I guess maybe the caveat I'm not necessarily concerned as much about nano weapon, but I would agree that maybe nano enabling technologies, as Lou had described, are all definitely things that are, that we will see in the future and that can be problematic. So that was just my.
And what about? So there are concerns with respect to threats from adversaries. What about ethical issues we should be thinking about now?
Right. As long as it complies with IHL, is there, we really didn't talk about this morning, right? Is there the ick factor, being targeted and killed by we'll say a machine, right? And that could be that could be some type of nanoparticle or agent, right? That is being deployed. And that is, that's seeking out the target, and it's engaging and killing that individual, just much like a bullet would. So is there some type of, does that get at our conscious? Is there something that just seems to be wrong with that? And that could be another panel, maybe panel number 5. But so but as long as that system, whatever that weapon is complying with IHL, I mean, it is being used in a proportionate manner and in a discriminate manner, then I don't see the ethical concern.
Okay. So before I open it up to the audience, Maggie, what about you? Are there ethical challenges we need to be thinking about now? Ultimately, of course, to ensure compliance with things like IHL, but even more broadly.
So yes, and there are sort of 2 ways that I look at this. One, so Lou talked about toxic nanoparticles. Most of that research has been done in the context of environmental health and safety. Even 10 years ago, the DoD had set up a committee because they were concerned about scientists who are working on nanotechnology potentially being exposed to what is effectively asbestos. So again, that's an ethics issue. To the issue that we are more discussing, in order to say anything really substantive with regard to ethics, we have to talk about the scenario. So if one is looking at a nano-enabled biological weapon that becomes a use for targeted assassination, well, then we go back to all your Article 36 review. So it's very scenario dependent. Is this at some point going to enable precision or discrimination? And it's not going to be the nanotechnology alone. It's going to be the nanotechnology as part of the system. And what I can see to be sort of intentionally provocative, which I've liked some of the comments that have been in the previous panels, well, what if we figure out a way, or not us probably, scientists who are smarter, the young kids right now who are 10, figure out a way to develop something that is able to discriminate so that you are only incapacitating combatants. Are we going to have some sort of ethical obligation to pursue that because you are not potentially harming non-combatants? So to talk about that in anything more than an utterly superficial means, we've got to get much deeper into the scenario. Much of the discussion that this community and others are having about AI, about biological agents, particularly the gene editing and synbio, about some of the cognitive neurosciences, about autonomy. Those discussions are going to inform anything that's going to specifically come out of nanotechnology.
Okay, terrific, thank you. Questions, comments, concerns? Yes, sir.
Looking at something from a more hopeful measure, defensive and countermeasures. A number of you have alluded to these matters already. Louis talked about the funds they having a nanotechnology-enabled laser. And DARPA back in 2013-14 had a system called Luster that it was fielding, or may have already fielded, to detect biological and chemical weapons. What's the way ahead for use of nanotechnology to be able to counter threats, detect threats, to increase our security rather than decrease it?
Okay, at one point, I forget whether it was the Army Research Lab or further along in the process, was looking at incorporating some nanomaterials into the armoring of personnel carrier vehicles. And I don't know how far that's, but that's a great example of exploiting the material properties. Didn't go too far because mostly it actually had to do with money. So certainly you can look at things to exploit just the material properties. It's lighter. There's been work to use something I call MOFs, metal organic frameworks, which have the capability of binding certain chemical agents, incorporating into the personal protective equipment, gas masks. What gas masks have right now is basically a really fancy activated charcoal. It's back in 1917, they burned coconuts to make activated charcoal. Now it's really fancy activated charcoal. So there's a great example of, hold on, let's think about a revolutionary improvement from this technology. There certainly have been, I mentioned decontaminants in the past. I mean, DoD is a gigantic entity. You're going to find nanotechnology research and then it being eventually incorporated into systems all throughout.
Other comments or questions? Yes.
Yeah, assuming there will be rules governing how nanotechnology is done, who would enforce violations of those rules? And does law enforcement have people capable of identifying violations?
So you're hitting on something that right now is being discussed in depth, not in the context of nanotechnology, particularly in terms of biotechnology, export controls. And anything having to do, you've seen this in 3D printing, additive manufacturing. It depends on, is anyone going to be controlling nanotechnology? I wouldn't recommend putting tax dollars towards that. But again, do our export control laws need to be looked at, reviewed, and potentially revised? Absolutely. Do we need more technically trained people in the Department of Commerce who are empowered to actually go through and do this? Absolutely. Do we need better cooperation internationally so that we are reducing the areas of vulnerability? So all of these people there is no magic nano fairy who's going to come in, and I don't think I'd want that.
Okay, one final question. Anyone have? Let me just pose something then. Chris, let me pose this to you. There was discussion this morning about the potential accessibility of non-state actors to biological chemical weapons. Do you see that possibility with respect to nanoparticles as delivery of those, or would one have to have sufficiently sophisticated sort of technology in order to be able to use that as a carrier that you're not so concerned about non-state actors?
Right. I mean, the analogy I think from the previous panel was a crop duster, right? Trying to deliver some type of chemical biological agent. I think there is a higher level of sophistication that's required, of course, for delivering something on this scale. As Maggie talked about, there are many other countries that are involved in this field, in this technology. Probably many are playing catch up. Is there a lot of open source resources that maybe non-state actors or terrorist groups are going to be able to leverage? And I will say that will increase to be the case. I just think the technical sophistication is much greater than if it's an airplane, if it's an IED, that we've seen in the last 10 years.
Well, I think we all now can appreciate that we may need to be a little more vigilant when we do see a fly on the wall. But please join me in thanking our terrific panel for a great discussion.